All right, continuing with Unit 5, our creature concept. Now, we went through this a little bit when I introduced the project, right? Part of this is question of the day 2, understanding copyright. Because when it comes to creature design, character design, that is something that's very commonly infringed on and sued over. You know, if you do any kind of version of a Disney character, you are really looking for trouble. So especially when it comes to using other people's pixels to make your concepts, understanding what makes it what's called transformative and original versus derivative, and therefore based on someone else's work, is the difference between owning it and not owning it, right? Owning it and creating your own original creative project versus infringing on someone else's rights. So that's an important one to look at. It comes with the reading from chapter 2, which is also in our course outline, which will help you understand especially the different ways that artworks are made available for use online through Creative Commons, but understanding all of the different stipulations. These are also things you can apply to your own work. And understanding fair use and appropriation. The number one problem artists have is they claim fair use when they shouldn't claim fair use. It's actually pretty difficult to be able to claim fair use for your work. We are lucky because you are in a higher education class. You fall under what's called the educational and spontaneous use clauses of fair use, but only for the work you produce for this class. So even if you accidentally infringe on people's intellectual property for your classwork, you cannot be liable for that. But if you use that classwork in any other way, like you sell it on your website, that's not fair use anymore. So reading this will help you understand that, help you ask some good questions as we start to discuss question of the day 2, which I hope to get to today if we have time. But going back to the unit, we have some examples, and just like our concept sketch or our concept for our landscape required a sketch that emphasized foreground, middle ground, background, this time our creature concept sketch has to emphasize anatomy. And it can be done with basic shapes. I also have an example drawn on the board. But it needs to showcase where the spine is and what the connections are. Because that's kind of the puppet that you're going to be building. That's the armature you're going to be building your creature's features on top of. And it's going to make your creature design a lot more successful. I'm going to leave that warning up so I remember to plug in when I get down to 5%. So same requirements as the fantasy landscape, minimum of 5. Though it is tough to limit it, right? Because you can end up using a lot. And I'm going to try, I say this every semester, I'm going to try to be pretty disciplined at not going overboard, right? Even though it's a lot of fun. So I'm going to try to use no more than 10. But as long as you're doing at least 5, you're meeting the requirements. Now to shortcut to it, you can go to assignments from the homepage. And what's nice about that is you can go right to where you post the assignment and where the breakdown is. But you also get some extra resources. And we haven't mentioned this before. If it's helpful to you, if you're a physical, traditional person rather than an online person, I make each assignment, linked there. So if you get lost on the website, it will always take you to different examples. But I also give context, right? So this is a past student's final presentation on a concept artist for creature creation. And a guy named R.J. Palmer. Yeah, Taylor, you'll like him.
He worked on, I forgot the name. It's like the game where he plays a dinosaur in Hell Creek. I recognize the art there.
Yeah, no, he's been very employed for quite a while. But he started as just a freelance illustrator doing this kind of work. He's really obsessed with dinosaurs, with natural history, and trying to make digital models that are really, really accurate of all the anatomy of these extinct creatures. Right. So this was one of his models. But he builds it completely from the skeleton up and then all the musculature. And actually, if you are a concept artist, you often learn how to build these things physically too with armature wire. We'll get to that. But these are all his digital models. And he just uses Photoshop. This is all 2D, not 3D. And then goes on to do some others, right? All based on real extinct species. And you always start with the skeleton and then build up to that. Then starts using that knowledge to build fantasy creatures. There's obvious connections between Western dragons and dinosaurs. And what's interesting about this is something you'll never see, which is wings and forearms. Because this is basically 6 limbs, right? And that's just not how our skeletal structures have evolved on this planet. So when you do it, you really have to understand the musculature to give it enough space at the back of the rib cage to fit the muscles and to attach those muscles for the wings to the breastbone. And he's doing it over the top of the collarbone, which is interesting, looking at how birds do it. And then this is the pro tip for those of you interested in this. Just doing it in 2 dimensions digitally, you are not going to really, you're going to hit a wall pretty quickly about how well you can conceive them. So it really helps to sculpt them in 3D and to just use, he just uses pipe cleaners, right, to understand these skeletal structures. And then from there, you can see how he'll map, he'll take a photograph at an angle he likes of his pipe cleaner maquettes is what they're called. And then he'll map his digital work on top of it. And they can be very simple to be effective. And then this same technique is used for his line art illustrations, which we'll be learning later, but for creature design. So this would be designing not for a live action film with special effects. This would be designing for an animated film, right, in 2D. Or even a 3D animated film. Often they're sketched that way. And then he got interested in Pokemon, and this was the freelance work that he posted and personal work that he posted that got him employed by studios, which video game studios, movie studios that he still does. So he likes Pokemon. He likes pop culture art. So he starts doing his own kind of fan art versions of these existing ones. And then he really got noticed for his realistic composites of Pokemon, like kind of taking them more seriously with anatomy and with how that evolution might work while still being fanciful. I particularly like his Charizard, which is a really tricky design, again with the wings and the forearms. And these are some of his recommendations. It's always good to be reminded, in order to do this kind of stuff, whether it's in your nature or not, and it usually isn't in the creative nature to be highly organized, but my God, is it important when you're working digitally to keep your assets organized. And so his big studio breakout was Detective Pikachu and doing the live action designs for the Pokemon there, which got pretty good reviews, right? And then led to a lot of other employment. So what does it all start with? It all starts with understanding the anatomy. I don't need you to be able to draw perfect bones. If you were to study illustration, you would have 21 hours a week of studying anatomy in different life drawing classes. And some of them would be just drawing from anatomy books and skeletons, and then going to the zoo and drawing animals, all that kind of stuff. And if you're interested in animation, illustration, that's always a good thing to do. For this class, creature design is just a small part of it. So we're going to emphasize a shorthand version of this, which are called skeletal templates. And that's what we post with our sketch. Now, anyone can draw these. Doesn't mean it's easy. It's to understand the anatomy that goes behind them. So this is the demo I have, right? And the most important structures, let me see if this will work actually. My screen tools, I've never really used these. The most important structures are the cranium. The cranium is the fishbowl that holds our brains, right? And even if you're doing a fantasy creature that's some kind of composite of non-vertebrate creatures, like insects, jellyfish, that kind of thing, you still want to have a sense of where the cranium is, because that's the focal point of any creature. So even though H.R. Geiger's aliens are based on beetle designs, composites, and a new skeletal template using insect parts, right? you still have a very recognizable cranium shape that is the focal point of the head. On that cranium is what's called a mandible, or sometimes in animal creatures, a maw. And you can just think of it as the upper and lower jaw. So on this creature, it's more duck-like, right, or horse-like. It projects out from the front. On a cat kind of creature, at the same angle, it would come out a little bit less, like a muzzle. Right? So that's the relationship of the cranium to the mandible. The cranium is always what's called a static shape because it looks the same from almost any angle. The mandible is a dynamic shape because it will change depending on the direction of the head. So what we usually add is what's called a direction line to show the angle that the head is facing, right? And that helps us understand where to place the eyes, whether they're placed in front or whether they're placed on the side and their size, where to place things like the nose, where to place things like the mouth, right? So that direction line can really help. We're also going to do that on the chest, so we understand which way the chest is facing. So that's what you start with, the cranium and the mandible, and that gives you the direction. You can even just draw random shapes and then decide, oh, okay, I want it to be looking up and this way. So the eyes would be here and here. And then you have a sense of where the back of the skull is. This is what comes from sculpting and understanding this in 3D or just feeling it on your own body. So if you take your finger and you jab yourself right at the base of the skull, you know, right where Neo from the Matrix gets jacked in, right? It's a nice pressure point. If you have allergies, you can massage that, kind of relieves a little of the tension in your head. But that is where the spine connects with your skull. It's where the spine connects with every skull of every vertebrate creature on our planet. So that is where you start your spine. But the spine is not a straight line, right? Not at all. Oh, I do have undo. Good. The spine instead it's like a slinky, right? It's a bunch of loosely connected bones and joints. So it usually makes some sort of S-curve. It can be long if it's a snake. It can be really short if it's a gerbil. And it will often flow through into a tail. But let's pretend we don't have a tail for this kind of cat-headed creature. So the first structure we look for on the spine is what's called the collarbone. So here's the spine. The spine on this creature is like this because the spine runs along the back. And this creature has kind of a shell which grows out from the spine. So the collarbone, you can feel it on yourself, is the thing that connects your two shoulders. It's not part of the rib cage, it floats above the rib cage. That collarbone you can just draw as an angled line, right? But when you draw it, you are deciding on how wide the rib cage is. And then I do two little ball joints at the end to show where those shoulder joints are. Just describing that space. Then you know what you need in order to draw the rib cage. The rib cage is as important as the cranium because it is a static shape. Your rib cage can expand a little bit as you breathe, but it can't bend, right? So that rib cage, just like your cranium, is always going to be a solid static shape in your creature. It's helpful, just like for the cranium, to know the direction of your rib cage. So you can draw a direction line on it. And then I often like to hollow out the bottom with a half circle because in order for us to be able to bend more forward into our abdomen than we're able to bend back, our rib cage is hollowed out about halfway up, right? You can feel that on yourself going up to your sternum. That way, you are then paying attention to where the base of your rib cage is, and you can feel that on your back. It's another good tension point, right? Because there is always some amount of distance between these static structures. There is always some amount of distance between the base of the cranium and the beginning of the rib cage. And what do we call that length? We call it the neck, right? So if I look at a gerbil, it doesn't look like a gerbil has a neck. but it does. It has a length of spine between the back of the head